my leave with Caroline, who was with me, take my leave of Richard Nixon. And it was an extraordinary moment, because he'd been always perfectly affable, but throughout the interviews, very formal and so on and so forth. And he opened the door and he said, "Hello, David." David. He'd never said David in the whole month of doing the interviews, 12 days of doing the interviews, preparing the interviews in advance. He'd never said, "Hello, David." Amazing, amazing. He'd call me David. And it just so happened that for 20 minutes we had something that very few people, I think, have seen. And I think the word I'd use for it is a carefree Richard Nixon. You can have an affable, a joking Richard Nixon, but always a certain transparent screen between him and other people and so on. But for 20 minutes he was carefree, he was happy.
And what did he say?
And he took Caroline to show him, this is where Brezhnev slept. Brezhnev slept here. He was a great swordsman, you know. The Russians are. You know, and then he said, "Manolo, get out the caviar the Shah sent us for Christmas." And he was for 20 minutes a carefree figure. And then, not the clouds exactly, but the screen came down at the end. And at the end he was the more formal figure again. And he said, he said, "Manolo, come and do your impression of Henry Kissinger. Come on, come and show," you know. And it was all very jolly, and very, very carefree. And there was a unique vision. And then by the time we left, he was the lonely figure standing but near his globes, because the globes operated in his house like religious symbols almost. The globes. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And he was, and I thought, you know, I wrote in the epilogue, which is quoted in here, about a sad man who so wanted to be great. I mean, you know, that particular...
And had the capacity to be great, except he had the demons that prevented him.
Absolutely, spot on, I think. Yes, I mean, I think it's that whole thing about there being two Nixons, and one Nixon, the good Nixon, in the end was outweighed by the bad Nixon. But there was a good Nixon and there was a bad Nixon.
Do you ever understand where Nixon stopped and Kissinger began, i.e., in terms of the success of the foreign policy?
No, I'm not sure, except, well, I know what they say, and actually it's very good fun. I mean, you've known the both of you know Henry very well and so on and so forth. But the thing was, in the interviews, the fun was that they both wanted the credit for the good things that had gone on in foreign policy, like big power, China and Russia,
China,
and not for the bad things. But they couldn't slag each other off because they were linked umbilically at the waist in their judgment by history. You know, so they couldn't slag each other. So what happened was Nixon took the line of saying, well, of course, Henry is a very brilliant man. He's very, very, of course, he's a very, very intellectual man, and of course, like most intellectuals, you know, he doesn't necessarily stick to his point of view. You know, he's like most intellectuals, he's often unreliable, and so on and so forth. Right? So he's praising his intellect and underlying the fact that he was the sort of man who needed a strong man like Nixon. And indeed, speaking to Henry on the phone, I remember that week that we taped that, and he said, "I suppose Nixon portrays me as the sort of unreliable intellectual who needs a strong leader around." I said, "Henry, have you been bugging these sessions?" And he said, no, I just know my boy. So that was his point of view, you see. Now, on the other hand, when Henry talked about it, he also wanted most of the credit, understandably, and so he took the line of saying, President Nixon was a great president. Perhaps his greatest quality was that he was a great delegator. He delegated everything difficult to
smart
me.
People like me.
Yeah, people like me. You know, so that was the way they both, you know, went for the...
It worked for both of them.
Yeah, exactly.
In the end, what did you understand about what makes him tick, Nixon?
I think that what made him tick was, I think, although, I mean, people who were protesting in the streets about the Vietnam War would find this surprising, I think probably that he was motivated by wanting to be a peacemaker. I think the peacemaker thing was close to his heart, not necessarily always close enough to his head.
And what go ahead.
But no, but that...
And what was his strongest quality in the pursuit of that? Was it his intellect? Was it his what?
I think you're right that his intellect was very strong in this area. Going over, as we've done in preparing this book, going over some of his underestimated things. I mean, I disagree completely with people who, at the funeral, said things like, we mustn't let one isolated incident affect our opinion of this man, because Watergate was not one isolated incident. It was one of many across the whole, whole field.
And the question you ask is whether, if it wasn't Watergate, would it have been something else?
It could have been.
Would the demons have done him in some other way?
Yeah. But one of the things we found surprising, really, was going over again his racial record, which, because he did it all sotto voce and through the system rather than large statements and supporting marches and so on, lots of people at the time thought, I mean, I probably was one of them, thought that he was probably anti the pro-black movement and so on. But when you look back, I mean, what his achievements, his quiet achievements on the area of race, are as good or better than any president who's come since, which is surprising.
But there's also the contradiction about Henry Kissinger being a Jew and anti-Semitism that comes out on the tapes.
Yeah. Yes, and that is bewildering. There was somebody who said, some very decent middle-ranking Californian, who said, I don't understand it. I've known Richard Nixon for 25 years, and I've never heard the Richard Nixon I hear on these tapes. I've never heard him slag off Jews or whatever, and I don't understand it. Yeah. And that remains a puzzle.
The conversations he had with H.R. Haldeman, I think, as I remember.
Yeah. I mean, but there were the various references and so on.
You did, in 1968, a series of conversations with potential presidents, the people who are running, including Robert Kennedy and others who are running for president. Yes?
Yep.
What would you be talking about today if you were interviewing presidential candidates? What is it that you think we need to know about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and Rudy Giuliani and Mitt Romney and down the line?
Well, I think, and I suspect in this sort of philosophy it's something that you and I share, but I think that it comes back to character a lot, in the sense of that with a leader, with a future president, you can never hear from him, however much you discuss the issues, which you've got to discuss the issues, but however much you discuss the issues, you can never know what he will do in an emergency, because by definition it's an emergency, and so he hasn't spelled it out in advance. And you've got to vote for somebody who you think will respond as a leader in the way you would wish your leader to respond, and therefore character is as important as issue.
We rarely do find a way to somehow get at those kinds of things that are so crucial to how you will perform under stress when the going goes badly. And whether you'll be able to acknowledge mistakes, whether you'll be able to turn course, whether you will be able to, make decisions that will avoid catastrophe.
Absolutely, and that is extremely difficult, extremely tough to do, and it is an intellectual as well as an emotional challenge. I mean, you've got to find the one British political leader said in this area, said John Smith, the late John Smith, the late Labour leader, said to me, you have a way of asking beguiling questions with potentially lethal consequences. And I said, I'd be happy to have that on my coffin. Thank you very much.